Hi, everybody. Welcome back. At a time with a lot going on in the world, we are here to talk about questions about work that you may be facing. And I kind of couldn't believe that this is a question we hadn't done yet. And so I'm really delighted. And folks who have watched this before know that our favorite is to do this with companies in which we are investors. And so for those of you who are here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future of work. And we're here to answer your questions about work. And I'm here with Michelle Volberg, who is the founder and CEO of Twill, which is a recruiting service that I'll let her tell you about. And she ran her own executive search firm, but was also in sales at a bunch of the most prominent media companies that you've heard of. And so she's had a chance to be in lots of situations where people require feedback, because hiring and convincing customers is obviously a feedback-rich environment. And so, Michelle, thank you for being here. And the question that we have today is, what's the best way to give somebody feedback?
Thank you. Thank you, Roy, for having me. I'm excited to be here. So just to give some quick context on Twill, Twill is a platform for engineers, product managers, account executives, marketing leaders, anyone in tech. If you work in tech, you could be a member of Twill to refer people that you know or have worked with for jobs. So we don't have recruiters on the platform. We have working experts. And then in terms of feedback, I found that the delivery of feedback is often more important than the content of feedback. And what I mean by that is knowing your audience. So something that we do at Twill that I found really useful is having everyone fill out a user operating manual, where they basically tell us what is the best way to work with you and to work with them as a team. And one of the questions is, how do you like to get feedback? And if you ask the question, you'd really be surprised that the answers are different. I personally like getting feedback straight up and like when it's happening. But the answers come varied. Some team members like to be told what they're doing really well all the time so that they can really appreciate the constructive feedback. So I found that that's kind of worked well, but being super specific has helped. And then framing what you're seeing as sort of first person versus third person. So instead of saying, you delay the project, saying, I noticed that the timing was off, like what happened? So kind of like taking the blame away from people helps. But I'm curious what you've seen, because
I think those are principles that I love. We have that same operating manual exercise. In fact, I think it might even be linked on our website.
Yeah.
We have, manual of me kind of thing that includes how people like to give feedback, and also, what hours do they do what kind of work, and
Yes.
What are the channels they like to be communicated in, because some people are text people, some people are not, all that kind of stuff. And the things I've learned about feedback, to me, it starts with, what is the purpose of feedback? And so first of all, actually, I should say 100% on the same page about feedback being about sharing the giver's experience of what the recipient has done. And I think a lot of people think the purpose of feedback is to correct behavior. And I think that's a busted way to look at it, because if you are somebody's manager or their peer, you may or may not be in a position to correct their behavior. There's sometimes you have to do it. And so it's like, hey, I noticed you did this thing that had a catastrophic impact. Let's tell you about that so we can fix it. But I think the core purpose of feedback is to provide the recipient with information that they don't have. Specifically, the information they don't have is how something lands for other people around them. And so opening up that window, and something that we've studied as a team, and my coach has spent a lot of time with me and to some extent with us as a team about, is opening up the window of what are the things that I know and you don't about what just happened. So for example, like the reason those first person statements can be so powerful is like, I saw you sent that email about this. I read that as implying ... I'm not sure if you knew that. And there sometimes doesn't even need to be a request for change in there. There can be, but there doesn't have to be. And one of the resources that I found most useful is nonviolent communication, which is this framework, and we'll link to it in comments on the tweet and on the LinkedIn. But nonviolent communication is all about owning what your experience is. And I've started to hear, anytime somebody uses the word you, as violent communication. Violent is probably a little bit of an exaggerated word for that, but then the recipient can hear it without being as defensive.
Yeah.
They can respond to it in whatever way works for them. They can say noted. They can say, thanks, I want to think about it. And it doesn't take away from the giver the ability to make requests. They can always say, I would prefer it if you ... And look, if the person is somebody's boss, then they can say, my expectation of your performance is that you will ... The other two things I just say are, I think in general, it's best to give feedback in the moment. It's good, more kind of relationship stuff, to keep the ratio of positive to negative feedback in a predominantly positive place, because people do hear that more easily. And to the extent what the giver wants is to change the person's behavior, even if that's not the purpose of the feedback, it can be something you want. People tend to respond more to positive feedback than to criticism. And the last thing I just say is I also really believe in consent, which is to say, beyond extenuating circumstances, getting the consent of the person you're about to give feedback to can be really powerful. And that consent can happen in the form of that manual of me, or kind of user operating manual you just described, where it's like, hey, I said, give me feedback anytime. Okay, you got blanket consent. Or it can be like, hey, I had an experience yesterday with that thing that happened. Can I tell you about it? You don't have to use the word feedback. You can, but sometimes when you use the word feedback, can I give you some feedback, is like, can sometimes make people recoil. But I call the consent thing the vampire principle, which is like the vampire can only come in the house if invited in the house. You got to get invited in the house before you start sharing tense stuff. And so those are some of my, thoughts on it. I'm curious how that all lands with you.
Yeah, I think timing is crucial. I really like your point of kind of maybe slacking or emailing or texting, like, here's what I'm seeing, and giving the person almost like a heads up. And it takes the pressure off of it, gives them time to think about it, and come prepared as well. But I think, like, above all, what I've seen, with running Twill and running previous companies and being a manager in corporate America, which is somewhat different, but setting expectations is really, really, I think, critical in the success of your team and how you kind of distribute and give feedback. And so what I found is feedback is often taken much better if the person receiving it has clear expectations of what they should be doing and their metrics, their KPIs, their goals, like what it is they're building ultimately. And so there's more, I'll say, room for improvement. And so, like, these conversations are just easier to have.
Have you found that feedback differs from startup environments and corporate environments?
Oh my gosh, yes. I mean, corporate environments, I feel like feedback is very political and diplomatic, because you're afforded that time. The company's not going to go bust if somebody screws up. Like, there's nothing that's going to happen to NBC if, like, some deal doesn't get sold, right? But at a startup, like, I think it's do or die. And so you don't really have the time to be diplomatic and political and wait a week to give feedback. I don't think you have it. So it doesn't mean that you don't give feedback in the right way and with kindness and thoughtfulness, but I think timing is just very different in corporate.
Yeah, I think that's so valid that, the stakes are higher on individual performance in a startup. I mean, period, end of story, full stop. That's one of the great problems with large organizations, is that the stakes for individual performance in the aggregate are very high, but in any one individual case may not be. And, I think you said the essential thing, which is you can still, regardless of the environment, practice these feedback principles of consent, of sticking to I statements and sharing the impact on you. Often find the best way to end a feedback kind of delivery is to say, and you can find lots of formats out there, the shit sandwich format and all kinds of other things if you want to, like, look up a specific framework. But I found the best way to end the delivery feedback is to say, is there more I can share with you to help you understand how I think about that? Because then you put the recipient in a place of curiosity and the goal is understanding. So you can do that regardless, but the pace differs. I also think that there's huge differences from country to country and even from place to place in the US. The way you give feedback, in the Midwest might be different from the way you give feedback in New York. And living in California, I often get like, that was very East Coast of you, by which they mean you were a jerk. And so knowing the context of the recipient's culture, matters. And by the way, that could mean their personal background can often influence this stuff. Like at my family table growing up, everybody yelled at everybody else. Everybody argued over everything. So when somebody's like telling me like, Roy, that was really stupid, it doesn't bother me that much. I mean, yes, of course it can bother me, but it doesn't bother me that much. But for some people, if I say like, hey, I noticed a slight issue with that thing you did yesterday, it can cause them to crumple. In part because also of power differentials in the workplace. It's really different giving feedback to a peer versus a superior versus somebody who works for you. Probably shouldn't have used the word superior. Somebody you work for is not really a superior, but you know what I mean? So I think that context is really important too. And I'm just curious, okay, one last question. In hiring contexts where you don't have the trust built up with somebody to be able to necessarily, like you don't have the long-standing relationship with them, but you might still want to give them feedback. I mean, you have worked as a recruiter, Twill right now, provides a hiring service. How do you think about what is possible in a kind of a just getting to know you, high stakes environment like hiring? How does it differ, or is it exactly the same?
In terms of like the interview process?
Well, you just give somebody feedback at any point. You might be the person trying to help them get a job, like you're the executive search firm and you think this candidate is doing well, but you saw something in how they did something. Or if you're interviewing somebody, like you're assessing them. And so what is and isn't appropriate in terms of feedback in that context?
I think you have to be very careful with people that you don't know well, even if you have good intent, because everyone takes things really differently. So there you do actually can use the strategy of, can I give you some feedback? Even though we don't know each other very well, I think it could help you. So most people that are looking for a job are super receptive to resume feedback, LinkedIn feedback, interviewing feedback, and they'll ask for it. And I think when they ask, it's a really good opportunity to give what you see. I have given unsolicited feedback and I've asked if I can give it because I think it could really help someone. And we've seen a lot of progress from that. I just think you have to be super careful when you do it because you don't know also if this person has been looking for a job for a long time. It's for their emotional state. You have to take things like that into consideration.
Yeah.
But I think if you're just upfront being like, look, I want to help you. This is what I'm seeing. I'm happy to share it with you if you want. You'll be surprised at like the positive perception to that.
And I think, that approaching with greater delicacy is really important. And it's almost like the word feedback isn't quite right because you're sharing what your experience was of what happened with the other person. I mean, we just had this comment from Andrew McKinney who, heard the input very clearly about, framing what you're seeing in the first person versus the third person. You're not sharing objective truth. You're sharing one person's perspective. And the other thing that I'd say that brings up for me is self-knowledge is really important for the giver because everybody likes to say, hey, I have something to share that I think is going to help you. But is that really your intent? Or is it really because you're frustrated in the moment and trying to vent some of your frustration? Is it really because something they've been doing is a repeated pattern and it's causing an issue for you? Is it really because, you think what they're doing is going to be destructive for the company, that kind of thing? It varies. And so honest self-knowledge of like, okay, there's a difference between what you say the intent is and like really knowing where it comes from, because where it comes from shows. And so I think the self-knowledge is really important. And, I just say my favorite kind of feedback to give, and I'm not, by the way, I'll just say practice what I say, not what I do. My team knows very well, like we're in a high feedback environment with a lot of feedback, but I'd say I'm 50-50 on doing it the right way, the most constructive way, because more important to do it, I think, than to do it precisely correctly because the information is so valuable. But I think my favorite kind of feedback is you did this thing that had a really positive impact. And I'm not sure if you're seeing how positive the impact was because, whatever you devote attention to grows. So particularly if you're the leader of a team, sunlight on those moments can make them happen more frequently.
I love that. I think people need to also remember when giving or receiving feedback that you're on the same team. Like you're on the same team. The feedback is there to help you blossom or the company grow. And so I think sometimes in corporate America, that gets lost in translation because there's like executives and then there's other people and they feel like
Well, and in reality, you may be competing with your peers for future jobs. And so
Mhm.
like acknowledging the reality of the situation, that while in principle on that you're on the same team, in practice, there are competitive pressures. I think just truth helps a ton. And one of my truths about recruiting is that it is often the case that when you're hiring for something, you don't know how the person arrived and if they've been primed. The candidate you're seeing has been like cajoled into being there. And so the idea of being able to use a service like Twill, where you know that the candidate has been approached by somebody who is in their network and
Mhm.
already knows them, is really powerful. And so thank you for creating it and allowing us to be on the journey of backing you. And any other final thoughts before we wrap?
No, I thought this was great, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, awesome. All right, to be continued. And if folks we get our questions often from all of you. If you have a guest you want to see or you have a question you want to hit, by all means, please feel free to reach out. And thank you, Michelle, to be continued.